This training course for forklift operation or power industrial lift trucks was initially designed for the Ochiko National Forest to meet our needs for forklift training. It could be utilized by others if needed. You are required to attend a training to be able to operate a forklift. Partly this is because the agency requires that, and that's the stipulation in our policy, but also because OSHA requires it, and they have some sound reasoning for that. Forklifts are very heavy, they're small, they're easy to get into bad positions, and so having a every 3-year training refresher on the operation of forklifts is a good investment in not causing serious and significant accidents with forklifts. As we go through the rest of this training, we'll point out how easy it is to get in a bad position with a forklift. So the purpose of this training is to get you the needed information for you to become qualified to operate a forklift. This training will give you a pretty detailed review or introduction to forklifts or power industrial lift trucks. We'll talk about the different types of trucks, how they operate, some safety pieces, a little bit on required maintenance, and how to deal with refueling them or recharging them. At the end of this course, you'll get a test. You take the test, you send it in, that test will get graded. If you pass your test, you will need to go schedule a hands-on operating session to be evaluated on your skills in operating a forklift. This course was designed and intended to meet OSHA's requirements for training our employees to operate a forklift, also to recertify on operating a forklift. From an OSHA perspective, forklifts are very hazardous. They certainly end up in lots of accidents, but also forklifts in general are used in a warehouse facility on a nice flat concrete floor that's intended or designed for forklifts to drive on. We don't typically operate in those conditions. So as we go through this, we'll discuss what those expectations are, and we'll also discuss the fact that they don't always apply to how we use our forklifts. Sometimes we should be changing the way we use our forklifts, but also we are capable of using them not in the typical fashion, I suppose is the way to put it. So we'll start with the types of lift trucks or forklifts. The type of forklift that you have is all based on how it's powered. So some of them are powered by diesel, some of them are powered by batteries, they're electric, some of them are gasoline, and some of them are propane or LP gas. The one here on the Ochiko that we still have in use, the main one at LaManna is propane, LP gas. We also have a gasoline one at Ochiko Ranger Station. We also have an electric one at Ochiko Ranger Station, but that's a silviculture one and separate from what we're generally covering here, but we'll touch on it as we go. We no longer have diesel. The parts of your lift truck are pretty simple expectation here. So you have your truck body, which is the bottom, the main body of the truck. It's very heavy. It's where most of your it's where your engine's at. It's your drive mechanisms and all of that counterweight to be able to pick up heavy loads. Your overhead guard is this guy that goes over your head and guards you from stuff falling on you or from the truck rolling over on you. And your hydraulic lift is this piece that's up in front. So those are your 3 main components for a lift truck. So as we get to know our lift truck, and every one of them may be a little bit different, take a look and figure out where your gauges are. You should have an engine temperature gauge. Engine temperature gauge is right here on this one. You should also have an amp gauge or an amp meter or an amperes gauge, oil pressure gauge, a fuel gauge, and engine hours meter. So your engine hours are right here in this one, and it doesn't have a gauge for, say, oil pressure or amps. What it has is these little lights. So this little battery one would be saying that there's a problem with the charging system or your amp gauge, so to speak. It doesn't tell you exactly what that problem is, but it tells you that you have a problem. This one's showing low oil pressure, and this one's a check engine, meaning something's wrong. In this case, the motor's not turned on, so nothing's running, nothing's correct. But a lot of the time, it's little lights like that that come up instead of the gauges that we're used to. Fuel gauge on a LP propane-driven truck is this dial on the tank itself, and that has two ways to read it.
All right, forklift. So when I'm looking at gauges on this forklift, and every forklift's going to be a little different, there's a gauge in here that tells me how much fuel I have. So my fuel gauge, in this case, it's propane. So it has a horizontal and a vertical gauge. It's not empty, it's not pointing at empty, it's saying that it's okay because it's laying on its side, and that's how that gauge works. If you stand this thing up, you read the other gauge. Okay, other gauges in this forklift are inside the cab, and so the other gauge is here. It's my temp gauge. It's showing 3 bars because I just pulled it out and drove it a little ways. So you keep an eye on that for your temperature. This little flashing, I can't tell if I can see that or not. There's a little flashing light there that tells me that the hour meter's working. There's the readout for the hour meter. And I have these lights that tell me that I have a problem with my engine, i.e. in this case it's not running. I have a problem with my hydraulics. Well, the pump's not running. I have a problem with my charging system or the battery because it's not running. And this one tells me that my fork system is locked out and not working because it's not running. It doesn't do anything.
So truck controls, again, getting familiar with your forklift and how it works. Know where the directional control is the steering wheel, which is the same as your car. Your raise and lower control is always going to be your first lever on your right. Your tilt control is always going to be your second lever. The other levers are additional. Different forklifts may or may not have more than 2. All forklifts will have 2. Parking brake, know where it is, and also know where the release is for it. Always put the parking brake on if you get out of the lift truck. Accelerator, brake. The accelerator looks just like your car. The brake looks just like your car, but there's 2 of them. And the clutch, it may or may not have one. Know where the horn is. It's a critical safety device. And your ignition.
So we're looking at truck controls here for my power industrial lift truck. First one is directional controls. So the directional controls on a forklift are going forward and reverse. It's on the left side typically. Occasionally it'll be on the right side on some forklifts, but generally it's going to be on the left side. And it's just a lever. So let me see that. Just a lever. Forward, because that's forward in the forklift world, or relative to the forklift. Reverse. Whew, backup alarm works. All right, go ahead and refocus. Okay, steering wheel. Lined up?
Yep.
Steering wheel. It's just like the steering wheel in your Honda, or any whatever car you drive. Only it's a little bit smaller, like if you drive with handcuffs on. I mean, it's a little bit smaller, and it's got this little ball, which really I'm going to say don't use that until you get really comfortable with the forklift, because that can get you in trouble. It makes you steer faster. Okay. Horn, just like in your car. Controls. So on every forklift, the first lever I come to here is going to be, the first one next to the steering wheel is going to be my raised lower. Okay, I pull it towards me, it lifts it up. I pull it towards me, and it's going to lift it up, like scooping. I push it forward, it's going to lower it down. There's the little symbols in here. I think your best bet is to know that this is up and down. Monkey with it until you figure that out. Get a good feel for it. Okay, the second lever when you're on a forklift is going to be tilt control. So this tilts the lifting mechanism back towards you, which is critical for balancing loads and shifting things, keeping from rolling off the forks. Or once you're ready to let stuff down, pushing it forward to flatten it back out. So it has this little push button piece here that if you lift it and tip it back this side of center, you push that button, push it forward, and it will go to flat. It will even itself out as flat. That's flat relative to the forklift, not relative to the ground. And that's the unfortunate thing in our environment. We do not operate forklifts on a nice concrete floor in a warehouse like we're supposed to. We operate them all over the place out here. More on that as we go. But know that that's relative to the forklift. It can be pretty handy sometimes to line things up. So this forklift, and not all forklifts have them, but this forklift has these optional controls. And this control is a power side shift, moves the forks over to the left or to the right, depending on which way I put it. Super handy, really nice. And this lever is the power fork control, which widens them and lowers them, or widens them and narrows them, which is also really nice because you don't have to get out and manually move the forks to make sure that your load's balanced. It balances a lot better. So it's actually a pretty good safety factor, just having that control in place. Much better. Parking brake. There's a lever, foot lever down here. Got it? Got it close enough?
Yeah.
Foot lever, just like a car. On your left foot, like in your rig. I mean, some cars I guess have the lever in the middle, but like in a pickup. Foot control. The release for it is on the steering column. It's blue, and it says a P on there with the little symbols like parking brake. Okay, that's your parking brake lever. Always set your parking brake when you get off the forklift. These things are really heavy. If this thing decides to roll across the flat parking lot, which isn't really very flat because, well, it isn't, and crashes into a building, it's going to cause a lot of damage. It's really heavy. Okay, accelerator. That one right there. It's a right foot control. Just like a car, just like a pickup truck. Pretty simple. It even looks the same. All right, and then you got a brake. Okay? And then you got a pedal over here, which is also a brake. It's not a clutch. Some forklifts have a clutch. This one does not. Older, especially the older gas style ones, will have a clutch and will actually have a lever for first and second reverse gear. In this case, it doesn't. Almost every forklift I've ever run has two brakes, one for each foot. And that's not really what it means because it's not like a tractor that has, steering brakes. Both brake pedals do the same thing, and there are times where it's really handy to be able to left foot brake and use my accelerator to RPM up. Makes my lift work faster. There's other applications for it, but get to know the fact that there are two brakes in a forklift. Accelerator brake, other brake, clutch. Okay, the horn is right there, just like in the car. The ignition is this guy right here. Okay, commonly you'll find this key in the cup holder because we train people to pull the key out. Pulling the key out is really about controlling who can access the thing, and I realized that in the cup holder isn't really very controlled, but it gets you in the habit of pulling the key out, which is a good thing. We'll cover that part later. So the keyed control pieces here, there's a bunch of safety features. Okay, so I crank it over and it went, but it was in neutral and the parking brake set. So if I kick it over and it doesn't start, I can't kick it over again. You have to completely turn it off and reset it. Okay, to get it to go again. If I am in gear, it will not turn. Okay, it has a safety feature. That's forward. If I'm in reverse gear, it beeps at me and I go, why is it beeping? And it won't start. And I think that if the parking brake's not set, oh no, it'll fire right up. But nonetheless, there are some safety features in there. If for some reason it doesn't start, that's the first thing to check. Also, there's a safety feature on the seat. If there isn't weight on the seat, it'll fire right up. But the control is locked down.
Find the data plate for the forklift and get to know what's in there. Most important stuff that is in there, it gives you your type, which hopefully you've already got figured out by now. It gives you the capacity. That's probably the most important piece for your lift truck. Also that load center, and that kind of helps to define where your load is going to sit. So it'll also tell you what your truck weight is, and that's just important to realize how heavy these things are.
All right, so data plate. I am in my lift truck. This data plate is right here. I don't know if that'll ever focus enough, but my Toyota forklift truck, model that, serial that, none of which I'm really that concerned about, but it tells me the type, which is LP for liquefied petroleum or propane. It tells me all kinds of things like tire size and such, and none of that I really care that much about. The important data is truck weight. I don't know if I can get that, dude. Okay, truck weight, 10,100 pounds for this little thing. That's pretty damn heavy. And then capacity, and that's this plate here, or this, all this here, and it changes. So if I look at this diagram, A is the height of the forks above the ground. B is, so I can zoom in on that. B is the height of, is the distance from the front of the fork out to the center of gravity of the load. And C is, I think it's the reference off center of the forks. All right, so this forklift, specifically A, when you are up to 178 inches above the ground, your forks can be up to 178 inches above the ground, and the center of gravity of your load can be 24 inches or 2 feet in front of the fork carriage, and you can pick up 5,800 pounds that way. All right, but if you shift that center of gravity out 6 more inches, you cut that load capacity down to 5,100 pounds. So generally we'd say this capacity on this forklift is 5,800 pounds. It'll pick up 5,800 pounds and move it around. 187 inches is pretty high up in the air for a lot of what we do. This thing will pick up a big heavy load if you're not moving it very high up and around. If you're keeping it low, it'll pick up a big heavy load. If you are trying to stack it really high in the air, I'd ask you why you're trying to stack something 5,800 pounds really high in the air. But that's the general concept of what this data plate shows you. We'll look at that in inch-pound equation stuff here in a minute.
So we're still looking at the components there. Those other ones were components of the body, or pieces that are on the body. Here we're looking at the lifting system. It includes the chains and the hydraulic cylinder that lifts your load. Also includes the forks and the carriage. And there you go. There's your lifting forks. So your forks are what your load goes on. They can move side to side on some forklifts. Almost every forklift I've ever seen, your fork can move side to side to get closer together. It happens to be that this forklift does it automatically, or not automatically, but with a lever control, and some of them you have to do manually. The idea there is to balance your load better so move your forks to get a good purchase on your load. Forklifts generally, almost always, but generally have rear wheel steering. You can turn very sharply with them, which is really nice in a warehouse environment. And that's really why it's done, because they're designed to be used in a warehouse environment where you're right angle stacking and moving through narrow corridors. The drawback to rear wheel steering is that it can steer really quickly, and if you're moving across a parking lot or something at a higher rate of speed and you crank that wheel, you can potentially tip it over simply by oversteering it.
Rear wheel steering.
And there's our stability triangle. So as it says there, the lift truck will not tip over as long as the center of gravity remains inside the triangle. That's very easy to do when you have no load on. But as you put a load on your forklift and you're adding weight to the front of it, your center of gravity starts to move forward. As you lift that up into the air and tip it backwards and forwards, you're starting to move that center of gravity more dramatically. Very simply stated, if your center of gravity gets out of your triangle, you're going to tip over. And here we have a diagram that shows that when your load's lifted up in the air, the higher up it goes, the less stable it is. So as you lift your load up into the air, your center of gravity starts to move forward more and more. Also, if you have a load that sticks out in front of the forks, or it's the center of gravity of your load is farther out than what is determined by your data plate or identified by your data plate, you're not going to be as stable. And depending on the weight of that load, it may tip your forklift over. I think the biggest key here is keep it low to the ground, keep it slow, don't go fast, don't turn fast, and keep it tipped back and center of gravity as close to the lift truck as possible. That's what's going to keep you out of trouble. And there you go. There's your fulcrum point, where it's showing the front tire is the fulcrum point of the lift truck, where your lift truck balances the load that's on your forks. So this here goes back to your data plate, and if you're looking at your data plate, it's going to tell you the load capacity of your forklift. It's also going to tell you the weight of the truck itself, but it's going to give you these ABC measurements, and there should be a diagram that correlates with that. And in this case, A is the center of gravity of the load in front of the carriage, and B is the height of that center of gravity above the ground, so 188 inches above the ground. So that's up there a long ways. It'll go pretty darn high and still be fairly centered. And then C is your center of gravity above the forks themselves. So assuming that you keep the center of gravity 24 inches above the forks, 24 inches in front of the carriage or less, you have maximum capacity on this lift truck. Every lift truck is going to be different, so take a look at those data plates. They're going to help you out a little bit. Again, keep in mind, keeping it low and keep that center of gravity as far back towards the truck as possible is the safest way to proceed.
Like this. So looking at the data plate again, note that the load capacity for this, that's the truck weight, the load capacity for this forklift is 5,820 pounds. That's a lot of weight. Remember, it can only be 24 inches in front of the fork carriage and 187 inches in the air. And let's look at what the fork carriage is in front of this. That's my fork carriage.
So inch-pound equation gives you, it's a way to calculate the capacity or whether or not this forklift can pick up this load, right? That's really great. It is something that you can calculate to figure out if you can work that load. However, generally we don't know what our loads weigh. It's just that the environment we work in, we're not in a warehouse, and our loads that we pick up are very rarely labeled. So we pick up all kinds of things in the warehouse or in the yard and move them around with a forklift, and that's just the reality of what we do. So keep in mind that where this inch-pound equation comes into play is that the farther forward of your carriage, the less stable your load's going to be, and you're not going to be able to lift it as high or pick up as much weight. So you want to keep it low. You want to keep your center of gravity as far back as possible, and that's going to be helping you keep you inside that weight capacity for the lift truck. When you're looking at load capacity, if you have any kind of attachment on there, which we don't have very many, but we do have like fork extensions, the weight of that attachment is also part of your maximum load. It's not necessarily considered part of the lift truck itself. So if you have an attachment on there, you got to calculate for that load as well. Again, we rarely have attachments, and if you do use fork extensions, be really careful. Those things are allowing you to keep your center of gravity farther away from the lift truck. Pretty self-explanatory. Keep it low and keep your center of gravity as close to the truck as possible. Tip it back. That's going to help. Like I said, tip it back. It helps to keep that center of gravity closer to the truck itself. Quiz time. So which ones are going to be most stable? Very good if you picked number 3. It's tipped back, therefore the center of gravity of this, instead of being out here, or worse yet, out here, is a little closer to the lift truck. It seems kind of funny when we read this, and you're operating a lift truck, not a race car or jet fighter. They actually move pretty fast, and they steer really quickly, and it kind of feels like you're racing around, or it can, and you can actually get yourself in a lot of trouble doing that, especially when you're loaded. But nonetheless, don't drive it fast. Keep your speed down. It's a really good way to get in an accident and crash, and they weigh a lot. They're really heavy. So if you run into something, that whole inertia momentum formula is not in your favor. Very easy to crash into somebody. You can't always see what's in front of you really, really well. So slow down. And there's a good example of somebody that tipped it over because they were running too fast. So quick turns. You can turn very sharp, and at speed, that can be a huge problem, especially if your load is raised. If you are up in the air and you turn too quickly, it's very easy to get out of your stability triangle and tip over. It's also very handy to be able to make those really sharp turns with a raised load to be able to do right angle stacking, to turn from an alleyway into a place that you're stacking your loads. So, well, it's a tool that works very well. It's also a tool that can be a little hazardous to function. So be really cautious about turning when you have a load up off the ground very far.